Welcome back, everyone, as we dive back into some great war history of World War I. And I will be sharing this, kind of cross-promoting this on my World War I Originals channel called Stories of the Great War. This is a video that was put out a few months ago by the Imperial War Museum. So in other words, this is a British organization, and they are asking the question in this video, how much did the U.S. really contribute to winning World War I? Of course, if you ask many Americans, well, we won the war all by ourselves, and if it weren't for us, everybody else would be speaking German. Now, we know that's not the case. The U.S. comes in very late to the war, but I would argue, and I think many others would as well, that the U.S. coming into the war when it did was decisive, was one of the reasons why the Entente, the Western allies were able to kind of see this thing through and ultimately defeat Germany. So I'll be curious to hear what they have to say about this. And as always, I will put the link down in the description, and I'll offer my own commentary about all of it. Also, if you want to follow and learn more about the topic of World War I have not only the channel, but a podcast called Stories of the Great War, in which we cover a lot of topics. The most recent episode was about the 110th anniversary of the Battle of Jutland, which was the largest naval battle of the war. So check that out. Let's go ahead and dive into this one. But before I do, I want to give a shout out and a thank you to Alan in Richmond, Texas, who signed up just a few weeks ago as a patron. Actually, just a few days ago. Thank you so much, Alan. Really appreciate that. Let's dive in.
At the beginning of 1917, the Allies faced a grim reality. On the Western Front, Germany had withdrawn to the heavily fortified Hindenburg Line, making any attack costly and uncertain. The failure of the Nivelle offensive in the spring further damaged French morale, leading to widespread mutinies. At sea, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, threatening to starve Britain into submission.
So we talk about a lot of this stuff often when we cover World War I. A lot of people tend to view Germany of World War I through the lens of Germany of World War II, and they're not at all the same thing. There is no good guy, bad guy in World War I as clearly as there is in World War II. Both sides had a lot of culpability in why the war happened. Both sides could blame the other for being the aggressor, which, you can argue the merits of that. Obviously, the war begins because of Germany's ally, Austria-Hungary, being aggressive in the aftermath of an assassination, and then there's all the dominoes that fall from there. But I am one who strongly argues that unrestricted submarine warfare was a perfectly legitimate response to the British naval blockade of Germany, and it was pretty much kind of the same thing. It was their own version of a blockade. And we can argue all day about sinking ships like the Lusitania, which kills civilians, but the Lusitania was also carrying munitions, and a lot of German civilians died because of that blockade. So both sides to every issue on this. But yeah, it's a complicated situation in 1917, and timing is everything. Russia is just collapsing on the Eastern Front, but while that's happening, the United States is entering the war in large part because of the unrestricted submarine warfare. The French, we make a lot about the mutinies and the things that are happening, but remember, the French have done most of the heavy lifting on the Western Front for the last 3 years at this point. Never, never, never compare the French of World War I to the French of World War II. Yes, the French in World War II surrender quickly, and we make jokes about that, but the French in World War I were warriors, man. I mean, they bled and bled and bled defending their homeland and took more casualties than anybody else on the Western Front and fought bravely in doing so.
And in the East, Russia teetered on the brink of revolution, its war effort all but over.
Britain was facing bankruptcy, and the war itself was at breaking point. The Allies desperately needed help. If they could persuade the United States to join the fight, Britain would gain access to vital loans, enough to keep the war effort going and avoid financial collapse.
Yeah, the U.S. is technically neutral, kind of like we were neutral in 1940, but very heavily favoring the Allied cause versus the Central Powers in terms of its trade. Technically we were willing to trade with anybody, but we really couldn't trade with Germany, for example, because of the blockade. So a lot of that trade's happening with Britain and France. Yes, they desperately did want us in on their side. I mean, whether you think that the United States made the difference in ultimately winning the war, you cannot doubt the fact that a major industrial power bringing millions of fresh troops and desperately needed supplies and food and money makes a huge difference for anybody. The same thing would have been true if somebody would have come in on the Central Powers side that way.
An American expeditionary force could tip the balance on the Western Front, bringing fresh manpower to break the deadlock and push the Allies towards victory.
However, by the time the United States joined the conflict in 1917, its forces lagged behind the realities of modern warfare. Meanwhile, Britain and France had already endured years of fighting.
Right, this is a great point. U.S. has not fought a war like this before. We have fought war with Spain in 1898. We fought, in the Philippine insurrection in the aftermath of that. You've got the Mexican punitive expedition in the years leading up to this, 1915, 1916. But nothing even close to this. And we come in with all of our ideas about how a war should be fought to a war that's been going on for 3 years that people have been adapting to and learning to fight in. And we don't carry with us any of that knowledge or information.
Revolutionary technologies and advancements in weaponry never before seen on any battlefield. In this video, we'll uncover just how much the US contributed to the Allied victory, both in combat and behind the scenes.
I love these pictures.
The United States' path to war was not straightforward. Before they entered the conflict, a strong pacifist movement at home and a tradition of isolationism kept the nation on the sidelines.
And the United States, at this point, more people identify as German American than any other single group of immigrant identity. There are lots of other groups there, but there's a lot of German Americans who aren't eager to go to war with Germany.
When war broke out in 1914, many Americans saw it as a distant European conflict that didn't concern them. However, Germany's actions in the Atlantic soon pushed the country's resolve to the limit.
The world's getting smaller, as technology improves, as the speed of communication improves, as the speed of travel improves, the world necessarily gets smaller, and these things that once felt a world away start seeming closer to home.
As a neutral nation, the United States opposed Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, where any ship bringing supplies to Britain or her allies within the war zone could be targeted. On the 7th of May 1915, the Lusitania was torpedoed, killing 128 American civilians.
So that happens off the coast, the southern coast of Ireland, fairly close to the coast, within a dozen miles or so, I think. But they had been warned. The Germans said, "Here's an exclusion zone around the British Isles. If you enter this, we'll sink you." And initially, they would surface. The U-boats would. They would basically order the ship to either evacuate or to surrender. Either way, they would try to avoid this, but very quickly they realized that when they did that, they were giving those ships time to prepare themselves and to fight back, and it wasn't a really good strategy moving forward. And so they would print advertisements in New York City newspapers warning people, don't get on the Lusitania, for example, because it's going to enter the exclusion zone and it may be a target for us. So they did warn people.
Germany claimed it was a legitimate military target, but the attack caused outrage across the United States.
Yeah, listen, if you're gonna put weapons on a passenger ship, don't be surprised when it gets sunk.
Yet the public's appetite for war remained minimal. President Woodrow Wilson entered into lengthy negotiations with Germany, securing compensation for the families of the victims and a promise to end unrestricted submarine warfare. In March 1916, however, the SS Sussex was also torpedoed. No Americans on board were killed, but it was a clear breach of the agreement. Germany issued the Sussex Pledge, promising again to stop attacking passenger ships.
And I think the easy way out of this, and listen, I'm pushing back a lot just because I'm trying to offer the other perspective on this. I'm not necessarily saying that I support the idea of unrestricted submarine warfare, but in war, you do what you have to do. And Germany could have probably just argued, hey, you know what, if you end your blockade, we'll stop sinking civilian ships.
In January 1917, Germany broke that pledge and resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. The US government's confidence in Germany collapsed. The question was no longer if they would enter the war, but when.
But it's also the Zimmerman telegram, which is a communique to Mexico, basically saying, hey, if the U.S. enters the war on the Allied side, if you help us out, we'll make sure you get your Southwest United States back. You know, the stuff they lost in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. What we would say today is Texas, Arizona. Well, not Texas. Texas was already gone, but Arizona, New Mexico, California, Nevada, those areas.
And in early 1917, a single message would change everything.
Oh, here we go.
The Zimmerman telegram is perhaps the most influential piece of code breaking to have occurred during conflict, as it brought the United States into the war on the side of the Allies when they needed it most. This is a facsimile of the coded telegram and the deciphered message. In January 1917, British naval intelligence intercepted a telegram from the German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmerman, to the German minister in Mexico, revealing a German plan to give US territory to Mexico.
So here you go, understanding our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The settlement in detail is left to you. You will inform the president of the above most secretly as soon as the outbreak of war with the United States of America is certain, and add the suggestion that he should, on his own initiative, invite Japan to immediate adherence and at the same time mediate between Japan and ourselves. So all of this was to keep the U.S. occupied so it couldn't offer more assistance to the Allies in Europe directly. It's a smart move if you think about it from a German perspective, but because the communication lines between Germany and the Western Hemisphere had been cut, they were using lines that were being tapped by the British. And when this came out publicly, Germany didn't deny it. They were like, yeah, we sent that. It's true.
In return for their support, should the United States declare war on Germany. The British shared the deciphered telegram with the United States government on the 24th of February 1917. This delay was in part to boost the growing anti-German sentiment, but it also gave them time to find a way of disclosing the telegram without compromising their advantage in code breaking or revealing that they had been monitoring American diplomatic channels. The telegram was reported in the press on the 1st of March 1917 and served as the tipping point, turning public opinion in favor of intervention.
And what has also happened is there was an election in November, right? And Woodrow Wilson's been reelected. So now he doesn't have to worry about reelection. He had been running on, we kept us out of war, but now, look at that. For Japan, California, maybe, for Mexico, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. This is all propaganda that's being used to kind of get the U.S. into the war.
It highlighted Germany's ambition and aggression.
The United States ended their neutrality and declared war on Germany on the 6th of April 1917, joining Britain and France as an associated rather than an allied power.
This is a letter from King George V, dated April 1918, which was given to American troops arriving in Britain on their way to fight in France in what he calls the Great Battle for Human Freedom. It is a cyclist.
And even on the medals that are given out after the war, it talks about the war for civilization, right? I mean, that's how this was framed.
Letter. Cyclostyling was a way of duplicating a handwritten document before the invention of the photocopier, using a stencil to easily produce copies. This letter of welcome emphasised the close unity of the Allied forces who they were joining. And so
remember that, again, looking at this through the last 100 years of history, we know the United States and the United Kingdom have what we call the special relationship. It's one of the closest alliances that there are. That didn't exist yet at this time, right? I mean, this is the beginning stages of that.
Served as a morale boost for the incoming US forces. It reads, "The Allies will gain new heart and spirit in your company." In the New York Times of the 1st of September 1918, it was reported that these letters were treasured by US soldiers as one of the most valuable souvenirs of the war.
Wow.
In 1917, Britain was in deep financial trouble. After nearly 3 years of war, its gold reserves were almost gone.
Listen, everybody was in a bad place at this point in the war. Germany After the blockade for the last 3 years, I mean, their people are starving. They're really struggling for resources. The Russians are about to see their Tsar abdicate and face a civil war. France is dealing with mutinies among their troops, and they've taken massive casualties, just like the Germans and the Russians have. And the British are struggling financially while they try to hang on to an entire empire while fighting all of this.
The country was on the brink of bankruptcy. At the beginning of April 1917, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Andrew Bonar, warned that Britain could only finance 3 more weeks of spending. Without help, Britain would have been forced to abandon the gold standard.
This is so important to talk about how close things were at this point. You know, if it had been another 6 months before the United States enters the war, I'm not sure it's enough, in enough time. That might have been enough time for Germany to get to the negotiating table in an advantageous position. Germany was never going to win the war, but they could be in a strong enough position to negotiate favorably, which they didn't end up having a year plus later.
A move that would have slashed its purchasing power and crippled its ability to buy the materials needed to keep fighting.
The United States' entrance into the war offered the Allies hope. The move was a military boost and an economic lifeline. With American financial backing, the Allies could continue purchasing food, raw materials, and vital supplies. To fund this effort, the US introduced Liberty bonds, similar to Britain's national war bonds. These campaigns were hugely successful. All 4 Liberty loans were oversubscribed, raising more than expected for the US government. The low interest rates on these bonds allowed them to lend to the Allies at rates far lower than the costly private loans they had relied on before.
By the latter years of the First World War, technological advancements were transforming the nature of conflict. The United States' entry into the war didn't just change the battlefield, it changed the balance sheet. With this new financial strength, Britain could further invest in the technology that would help break the stalemate that had defined much of the fighting on the Western Front.
After declaring war, US industry took time to reach the level of war production that Britain and France had already achieved. The United States had little experience in producing complete artillery pieces.
Yeah, the U.S. doesn't have the technology that the other powers have been working on, not to the degree anyway. We don't have an army. Army's very, very small at this point. It's going to take a long time to get that built up. And so even as American troops are arriving overseas, they're using a lot of Allied equipment, especially planes and artillery and tanks.
So heavy artillery, tanks, and aircraft were mainly supplied to the American expeditionary forces by the French.
Right.
Much of their equipment was purchased in Europe, and most of the shells fired by them were French-made. This partnership between the United States and the Allies was essential. The US could not have equipped its army without Allied assistance, while the Allies relied heavily on American resources. Steel, copper, high explosives, and propellant from the US were vital for armaments and munitions programs. US fuel supplies kept the Allied armies moving, the Royal Navy operational, and the Air Forces flying. Among the most striking technological developments was the tank. Tanks were a British invention that were first used in action in September 1916.
Yeah, it's at Flers-Courcelette, which is part of the Somme battle. The Battle of the Somme, you know, when we talk about the Somme, everybody thinks of July 1st, 1916, but the Somme goes into August, September, October, and ends in November. And September 15th, 1916, you have that first use of tanks at Flers-Courcelette. But the first massive use of tanks, big tank battle, is going to be at Cambrai, which is also in that general area.
Tank crews endured hot, noisy, and unhealthy conditions inside. This tank mask was designed to protect the wearer from splash or flying metal splinters caused by the impact of bullets hitting the outside of a tank's steel hull. In 1918, the Allies deployed their new tactics more effectively to break the stalemate on the Western Front, using artillery, tanks, and aircraft alongside the infantry.
So this is huge. Now you're using combined arms, right? You know, you're not just throwing tanks out there. You're figuring out how your different components complement one another. What's the role of the tank? What's the role of our aircraft in this? What's the role of artillery? What's the role of machine guns? What's the role of infantry? And how do we coordinate it so we're using the strengths of each at one time. And this is something that the Allies start doing really, really well.
Coordinated all-arms approach. As the fighting moved out of the trenches into the open, tanks were a key component in crushing obstacles and destroying machine gun posts. They were a new kind of weapon to integrate into battle plans, but particularly so for the American Expeditionary Force, who were learning this combined all-arms approach.
Yeah, and this is where you have the rise of people like George S. Patton, who is going to be one of the first real leading tank commanders for the Americans over there. He goes over initially as a part of Pershing's staff. Pershing was dating Patton's sister at the time. Back home in the States, you have Dwight D. Eisenhower running a tank school. He never saw combat in the First World War, but he's running a tank school. So Americans are getting introduced to this new weaponry. And same thing with the planes. You're going to have guys like Eddie Rickenbacker from Ohio, who is going to be America's ace of aces with 26 aerial victories. A lot of those coming in just a 6-week span in September and October. So the U.S. does get caught up to speed pretty quickly.
By September 1918, the US Army had 2 fully trained tank battalions under Lieutenant Colonel George S. Patton.
There you go. Man, am I doing a lot of saying stuff right before they do in this video today.
US troops were also unprepared for the realities of modern industrial warfare. They lagged behind in producing basic protective gear like helmets and gas masks.
All of the same things that the British and the French and others had gone through as well. It's just they had already gone through it because they'd already been fighting this war. Now the Americans are having to go very quickly through learning the same lessons.
That was essential on the Western Front by 1917.
The US Army had no steel helmet available when it joined the war. British helmets were supplied to the AEF until they could manufacture and supply their own.
And sometimes you'll see, for example, the Harlem Hellfighters, 369th Infantry, some of the black units that were attached to the French were wearing the French helmets, which are very distinct looking and blue.
Between July and November 1917, a batch of 400,000 steel helmets were issued. This helmet on the mannequin here is one of those. Manufactured by Thomas Firth and Sons of Sheffield, it is typical of the Mark I type. This helmet and uniform were worn by Gilbert Veen from North Dakota, who first went into action on the 15th of March 1918. He served with the US 1st Gas Regiment. He was recorded as having participated in many actions, including the battles of Saint-Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne.
Those are the 2 big offensives for the Americans, right? Saint-Mihiel in September of 1918, and then turning right around and going into the Meuse-Argonne offensive later that month and into October.
The AEF was largely unprepared for chemical warfare and heavily relied on the Allies to provide protection and gas shells. It is believed that Gilbert Veen was injured when their own gas was blown back towards them. He survived the war and was awarded a Purple Heart for his gas injuries.
America entered the First World War with troops unprepared for the realities of modern combat. The Allied powers and the US military needed to work quickly to transform the arriving forces.
And the goal so at this point, Ferdinand Foch is the French general who is Allied commander-in-chief. He's the Eisenhower in Europe for World War I, basically. And his goal, and the British supported this, was that Americans should be plugged in wherever they were needed on the Western Front. But General Pershing comes over as the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces with a clear command from Washington that the Americans are to fight as an American army with an American sector under American generals. And Pershing is going to push really hard for that. But he also has to recognize that initially the U.S. doesn't have that capacity. So they are going to plug them in, and that's how you're going to get Americans fighting in places like Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood. You're going to have Americans fighting at Cantigny, like the 1st Infantry Division. 2nd Division was the one fighting at Belleau Wood. And 3rd Division at Chateau Thierry, fighting at the Marne. They're going to earn the nickname the Rock of the Marne. But eventually there will be 1 and then 2 American armies fighting in the Meuse-Argonne offensive.
President Wilson appointed General John J. Pershing to organize and command the American Expeditionary Forces. Pershing, however, was preparing his troops for a 19th century war. He favored massed frontal infantry assaults with rifle and bayonet charges, while the Allies had learned through battles such as the Somme in 1916 that success required a combined all-arms approach. Veteran British officers were sent to America to advise and train US Army leaders in the new tactics of the Western Front. But the ordinary US soldier largely learnt on the job. They were often posted to...
Think about that in your own life. If you have lived as long as I have, you know that you can go to college, and college will give you important tools to use, but that information will only get you so far. You are going to learn so much more in your first 6 months or a year actually doing the job than you did in 4 years of college. It's the same thing with this training, right? You can train people, you can tell them what they need to know, but they're really going to learn when they actually get there and start fighting.
Quiet sectors to undergo frontline training with more experienced Allied troops.
Though Pershing fiercely insisted that American troops fight as a separate army, mounting pressure from Allied command forced a compromise.
Right.
Selected US divisions were temporarily attached to seasoned British and French units, quickly learning modern tactics.
So there's a great example right here. You can see a French helmet right there. So you can see the different helmets going on at the same time, but that's very clearly a French helmet right there.
And proving more combat effective during the remainder of the war. Following heavy Allied losses in the German spring offensive.
And this is a great, anytime you see images from the Western Front after there's been any fighting at all, this is what you're going to see. It just looks like a desert wasteland. Occasionally you'll see what's left of a few trees, but there won't be any branches on them. They'll just look like telephone poles sticking up. And that is just because the artillery is to an absurd level that falls on these sites. There is nothing left anywhere.
Pershing later agreed to send machine gunners and riflemen to support the front, rather than entire divisions.
The US also had little experience in flying or maintaining aircraft. The Allies had advanced aviation through the years of combat.
We did have some Americans that were fighting. You had the Lafayette Escadrille. If you've ever seen the movie Flyboys, heavily fictionalized version, but that's basically the story that they're telling, is the Lafayette Escadrille. These are guys who were Americans who had an American unit but were part of the French Air Forces. And eventually some of those guys are going to then transfer to the Americans.
So many American pilots were integrated into Allied squadrons, flying foreign-built machines.
Yeah, a lot of Americans are flying the Newport, the French Newports.
Crews trained alongside British mechanics at airfields like Duxford before heading to France.
Duxford.
It took over a year before the American Expeditionary Forces were ready to play a major role on the Western Front.
Yep.
The Allies, meanwhile, were planning for a decisive victory in 1919, and by then, the AEF aimed to be self-sufficient with over 4 million men.
The anticipated arrival of the US Army forced Germany to act sooner, launching their spring offensive earlier in 1918.
And this is what's key here, is that even though the Americans aren't a presence on the line in large numbers in the spring of 1918, their presence has a huge impact because it forces Germany to try and desperately win the war with this spring offensive, or this Kaiserschlacht as they call it. And their goal, you see the Belgians up here in the extreme north, you have the British Expeditionary Force there in Belgium and in northern France, and then you have the French holding the rest of the line. And their goal was to drive in between the French and the British, knock the British out of the war, and force France to the negotiating table before the Americans can arrive in such large numbers that they're going to be able to turn the tide.
Ironically, this accelerated the deployment of US troops to the Western Front.
And it accelerated the decline of the British, or of the Germans, because they exhaust what they've got left after they pull all these, like 50 divisions off the Eastern Front to fight in the West once the war in the East is largely done.
Some of the first soldiers of the AEF to encounter the enemy were railway engineers caught in a German counterattack at the Battle of Cambrai on the 30th of November 1917. Captain Hulsart and Lieutenant MacLeod were decorated for their gallantry on that day. However, the first major offensive involving US divisions was the Battle of Contigny in May 1918.
So this is the big red one.
It was not until August, when enough troops had arrived on the Western Front, that the United States First Army came into being.
So we covered Cantigny in the Great War documentary, which I had the privilege of being a part of for the History Channel. It's now on Netflix, so check it out. You'll see me in there. You'll see me right at the very beginning and not for about 40 minutes after that, but then you'll see me regularly from that time on. We talked about Michael Ellis, who is a 1st Division soldier who gets the Medal of Honor during the war, and incredible stories. And actually, my friend JD on the History Underground did some video at Cantigny if you want to see stuff from the site.
In spring 1918, the Allies were exhausted and desperate. The German spring offensive had pushed them to the brink of defeat. However, the Germans had outrun their supply lines, and the fresh arrival of American forces was about to tilt the entire struggle in the Allies' favour.
By July, the initiative had shifted. The Allies launched the Battle of Amiens on the 8th of August 1918, the opening of the 100 Days Offensive. The surprise attack at Amiens shattered German morale. Around 30,000 soldiers surrendered, and
the Germans call this, well, let me wait and see if she says it first.
Morale never recovered.
Yeah,
General Ferdinand Foch appointed...
The Germans called this the Black Day of the German army. I mean, this was the moment at which the Germans started to understand that the war was probably lost.
Allied commander-in-chief in March, coordinated French, British, and later American forces.
Yeah, so it's Ferdinand Foch and General Pershing right there. Really cool to see some of this video.
His strategy was relentless. Consolidate gains, then strike elsewhere along the line.
So here we have King George V. You've got Field Marshal Haig, who's the British overall commander. You've got some other guys that are really popular here. I don't want to get the names wrong, but I do recognize a few of them.
This stretched German manpower and resources to breaking point. The increasing number of US troops in France enabled the Allies to cover the front and keep pressing forward, turning survival into victory.
A month later, US forces were fighting the Battle of Saint-Mihiel. Fought from the 12th to the 15th of September 1918, Saint-Mihiel was the first and only battle planned and led by the US Army.
So Saint-Mihiel was, this was supposed to be the big coming out party for the American First Army. Its first opportunity to fight in independent action as an American army. The goal was, you see this salient right here, the Saint-Mihiel salient. The goal was to close off the salient and then take Metz, which is a vital German rail hub that is providing supplies to this entire region for the Germans. You take that and you throw off their supply abilities. But the problem is, right about the time that they are ready to launch the Saint-Mihiel offensive is when Foch comes along and says, no, we've got this idea for this larger offensive, and we need you, the American army, to fight the Meuse-Argonne sector, which is west of Verdun right here, along the Meuse River over to the Argonne Forest, and we need you to launch straight north there. So there's a compromise, and they decide to seal off the salient, but then quickly turn to fight at Verdun, fight west of Verdun and Meuse-Argonne. And the guy who's given the task of doing all the logistics of launching a major offensive and then immediately turning the entire American army around to move them into position for the Meuse-Argonne offensive is a guy on Pershing's staff named George C. Marshall, who's going to be the American Chief of Staff in World War II.
It was a success, improving Allied positions and rail links. They captured the salient, but did not push on to capture Metz as planned. In reality,
didn't have time.
The Germans were already withdrawing.
They were.
So the victory was easier than expected.
Just weeks later, the AEF faced its greatest test, the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which Pershing described as the greatest battle in American history.
And it's impossible to argue with that. It is the largest battle in the history of the American military. It's the largest battle in the Army's history to this day. Over 1 million American soldiers in one offensive. Basically half of all American battle deaths during the entire war happened in the 47 days of the Meuse-Argonne offensive.
Beginning on the 26th of September and lasting until the Armistice, it involved over 1 million US troops with around 120,000 casualties. The plan was to break through the Hindenburg Line and push into German territory.
And Meuse-Argonne, this is where you're going to have Alvin York, you're going to have the Lost Battalion, all the stories that we typically hear are going to happen during a couple of weeks span in October. This is where you're going to have fights at Vauquois and at Montfaucon and these iconic places that have become a part of the lore of the American military.
But inexperience and poor leadership contributed to their slow progress, and costly frontal infantry assaults were used to push forward.
And there's a pause that's ordered in the middle of all this, and Pershing gives up command of the American First Army in order to oversee the entire American military, creates a second American Army, and they reshuffle some leadership to make things more efficient, and then they really start moving.
During this offensive came the incident known as the Lost Battalion, when 9 companies of the 77th Division were encircled by the Germans, as they did not realize that their flanking units had been pushed back.
Right, so they weren't lost. They knew where they were the entire time. I've been to the site. It's a fascinating place to visit. Really, really cool story. Not cool for the people who were involved, obviously. Devastating for those people. And I've done a podcast episode about the Lost Battalion, so check that out. They knew where they were. They were just cut off, and they couldn't get to them. And if you want to watch a good World War I movie, watch the movie The Lost Battalion with Ricky Schroeder playing the commanding officer, Charles Whittlesey, of that unit.
Over 500 US soldiers were cut off and surrounded for 6 days, from the 2nd to the 8th of October. With no supplies and even subjected to friendly fire, they held out until reinforcements broke through, but with many casualties.
Yeah.
Following the initial attack at Meuse-Argonne, the Allies pushed forward relentlessly against German defences. The combined forces launched daily coordinated assaults along the Hindenburg Line, leading to the San Quentin Canal attack on the 29th of September 1918.
The British brought in 2 US divisions to relieve the exhausted Australians who had been fighting non-stop. The plan was for the Americans to break through the line, consolidate their position, and then the Australians would move through them to continue the advance. This worked for the US 30th Division, but for the US 27th Division, things quickly went wrong. A failed attack 2 days earlier had left troops scattered in that sector, so the usual creeping barrage was abandoned. A thick fog had descended on the battlefield, and they faced some of the strongest German defences. The Australians were forced to move up to support the Americans in 4 days of fierce fighting before they broke through and captured their objectives. Despite this setback, the Battle of St. Quentin Canal was an overwhelming Allied success.
Yeah, and this is an area I'm going to visit on a future trip here sometime to the Western Front to make some videos about St. Quentin Canal. It's a really important story we need to be telling. And this is a great point. I haven't mentioned this so far, and I know I've been promoting a lot of other things, but listen, World War I's one of my areas of expertise, and I love to talk about it. We're going to be visiting all these sites. We're going to the Meuse-Argonne offensive site. We're going to the Somme. We're going to Ypres. We're going to Chateau Thierry and to Belleau Wood. I'd love for you to join us. We've still got plenty of room on our Western Front tour. We have 22 of us going so far, so the tour is a go. We've hit the minimum number. Now it's just gravy if we can get some more folks to go. It's at the end of October of this year. The link's down in the description. You can download the brochure, read all about it, and reserve a spot. You don't have to pay for the whole thing just yet. Just reserve your spot, put some money down on it, and we'll be touring all these sites together.
And a turning point in the 100 Days Offensive. The complete breakthrough in early October signalled the beginning of the end for the German army.
Yeah.
General Ludendorff reportedly said that the situation of the German army demands an immediate armistice in order...
Yeah, listen, Ludendorff later is going to be one of those guys who sponsors the stab in the back myth that, hey, we could have won it on the battlefield, but we were betrayed by our civilian leaders back in Germany. No, Ludendorff, you don't get away with saying that, because you were one of the people who were telling your civilian leadership, we have to sign an armistice, we can't win this war.
To save a catastrophe. On the 4th of October 1918, Germany contacted President Wilson to discuss an armistice.
Yeah.
By November 1918, the combined weight of Allied offensives and the arrival of fresh US troops had broken German forces. Exhausted, short of supplies, and facing relentless attacks, Germany agreed to an armistice. By then, the American expeditionary forces outnumbered the British Army and held a longer stretch of the front line. But despite their size, the British and French had captured more ground. The fighting stopped on the 11th of November 1918, and the world had changed forever.
This would have been a familiar object to British veterans of the First World War, but this is the US version of the Victory Medal.
And if you look at the French and British versions, they're very similar. to this. They all have the same design. The Americans have these clasps that they put on it for where they fought, which I'm sure she'll talk about.
It has the same ribbon, but a different design on the medal. It is also sometimes called the Allied War Medal because it was issued by 14 of the Allied and associated nations. Yeah. The United States version is the only one that has these campaign clasps on the ribbon. There were 13 Army battle clasps available for major ground operations. There was also this defensive sector clasp, which was issued to cover any action that the recipient was involved in that was not covered by any of the named battle clasps. This medal was issued to Harold Beckett, who was an American machine gunner serving with the 42nd Division in France.
The Rainbow Division, yeah, that's the one that Douglas MacArthur was a part of. And I'm going to be bringing some of these types of things, like medals like this, on the tour with us, so you'll be able to see those things up close.
You can see he was involved in the battles of Saint-Mihiel and Meuse-Argonne and in defensive actions. He survived the war.
After the First World War, the US pushed for peace, but Wilson's 14 points clashed with the aims of Britain, France, and Italy, and the Treaty of Versailles only partly reflected his vision. The Senate rejected it, and in 1921, the US signed a separate peace with Germany, staying out of the League of Nations and weakening its influence.
However, President Wilson's ideas endured, and after another world war, the concept of an international body to mediate disputes regained support. In 1945, the United States became a founding member of the United Nations.
By the end of the First World War, around 2 million American troops were on the Western Front, suffering 320,000 casualties in just 6 months. Had the fighting continued into 1919, their growing strength would almost certainly have proved decisive. Yet America's greatest impact lay not only in manpower, but in the immense economic pressure it brought to bear on Germany. Once the 1918 Spring Offensive failed and the Allies counterattacked at Amiens, it became clear that Germany could no longer win the war. The arrival of US forces revitalised Allied morale at a moment of crisis. With the support and experience of Britain and France, the US Army rapidly transformed from a force suited to a 19th century conflict into a modern fighting machine. Together, these combined strengths overwhelmed Germany and helped bring an end to a conflict that had reshaped the world.
Yeah, I think that was a very fair look at that. I think they did a great job. I think that was a very balanced view of everything, and I couldn't agree more with their assessment. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Check out the links. Check out the podcast. Check out the Stories of the Great War channel. Check out the upcoming tour and see if it's something you want to be a part of. If you have any questions about it, you can contact me through the tour page, and I'll be glad to answer those. And I'll put some links up on the end screen here that you can check out for yourself. I want to thank Chris Robinson and Devin Diego for your support on Patreon. Thanks so much.